Thanks for tuning in, everybody. And I wanted to just say thanks to Lauren and everyone out there for tuning into this series. And today we're going to talk about using RevoFit as a suspension technique. Typically, when people think of RevoFit, they're thinking of adjustable socket technology. So they're using RevoFit for compression to tighten the fit. They're using RevoFit for expansion, for easier on and off, for weight gain, volume gain, seated comfort. But today we're going to talk about using RevoFit as a primary and secondary suspension technique. So I'm going to share my screen with you. And we're going to start with the most common or typical use of a RevoFit suspension method would be to create a bony lock. So starting with, let's see here, excuse me while I share my screen. All right, so I think everyone can see that. We're going to start with a Symes amputation. So we use RevoFit here to control the medial panel. As you can see in this video or in this picture, the dial is mounted proximal, so it's easy to get to, and it controls the medial door for easier on and off. So they can pop the dial, open up that door, slide the condyles through the socket into position, and then they push the dial down, close the door, lock it into place. As you can see here, you can't really see any tubes or any anything around the dial. Everything's pretty concealed. What they did here was they actually did 3 laminations on this socket. Typically, we only do 2. We'll do 1 lamination. We will then transfer the alignment. We will add the kit after that first lamination. Then we'll do a second lamination to lock the kit, the tubing, and the dial into position. And then for this one, they wanted to make the socket very smooth in appearance. So what they did was they added foam, a 2-part hard foam, over that second lamination, over the tubing, and around the dial to help build up around the dial and so that it didn't stick out so much. And to blend the tubes so that they're very smooth on the socket. So as you can see here, and I don't know if you can see my cursor at all, but you can see that there's no tube lines anywhere, and the socket or the dial is very recessed. Some people ask, where do you get the Caucasian dial? We don't sell dials that are Caucasian, but you can paint them. So this was just painted on with a spray paint very carefully to make it blend with the rest of the socket. So these are some other examples of Symes. We've got on the left side there, that Symes has an anterior door. Typically, we don't see many anterior door Symes, but I thought I'd show that just as another example of what you can do. On the left side, you can also see that the dial is mounted proximal. For easier access and use. On the right side, that is also a medial door with looks like 4 lace crossings. That's a pretty standard design. The dial on the right side is mounted posterior for easier use. When you're mounting the dial, they do stick out about 1 inch, so you do need to make sure that you're going to put it in a spot that's not going to interfere with their clothing, or for example, if maybe they ride a bike, you wouldn't want to put the dial on the medial side. And we typically put the dial on the frame for the lowest possible build height. You can put the dial on the panel, but if you're going to pad the panel to add a little bit of compression to your Symes, then it's going to make that panel and make that dial stick out a little bit further. So if you want the lowest possible build height, we often recommend putting the dial directly on the frame. And this is kind of the design method that we use for creating a Symes. We want to route the lacing to the dial. You want to route the top of the panel and the bottom of the panel to the dial first. Those are the parts that the parts of the panel that are going to move first. So the top and the bottom are routed directly into the dial. And then if you have any turnarounds, then those happen in the middle. You want the top of the panel and the bottom of the panel to move at the same time. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I have a Symes here that I hope you can see. We only have 2 crossings here. We want the dial, we went on the dial posterior, and then we rounded the tubing to the top of the panel, and then a turnaround, and then back down to the bottom of the panel. And that allows for the panel to move in and out very evenly. If you mounted the, if you routed the lace or the tubing across the top first, and then across the middle, and then across the bottom last, then as they tighten the socket, the panel inside would close at the top first, and then at the bottom last. So we don't want that to have any gapping or any kind of gapping at the bottom. We want these to be moving at the same time. So if we're doing multiple crossings, then we want to make sure that the top of the panel and the bottom of the panel are routed to the dial first. So that is our kind of a basic Symes overview, creating a bony lock for the Symes amputation. Okay, so this is a kind of an unconventional Symes, like I said. We've got a floating anterior panel. The anterior panel has a little key notch at the top portion. And that keeps the anterior panel in position so that it doesn't float up or down. As you can see, the dial is mounted posterior, and it routes to the distal portion of that panel first. And that's by design. We want the distal portion to close first, and then we want to have closure happen mid shaft and then proximal last. That way, we know that the anterior shell is secure on the shin at the distal portion, and then it moves its way up to the proximal portion. There's also an anterior openings for the foot and also for the tibial tubercle at the top portion. And that's just a pretty neat design. I've never seen one like this. It's got an, looks like it's a Kesey cone or a P-light foam insert. And this was also used, this was used for a pediatric patient. So pretty small leg, but a pretty interesting design. So now I'll move on to a knee disarticulation. This was made in Germany. This has 2 dials. The distal black knob that you see is actually a valve. Then there's a small opening, distal opening, that is the opening for the patella. And then you can see above that, you've got 2 panels, one medial and one lateral, that's connected to a dial. That allows for easy on and off. It also allows for some femoral stabilization by tightening those panels, medial and lateral. You can stabilize the femur and get a pretty good lock on the femur. Large openings, and then the top proximal dial controls a strap that is wrapped around the gluteal fold. So that gives the patient some proximal compression and expansion. They use that mainly for downing and doffing. They'll open that top dial up when they're seated for some seated comfort. And then when they get up and start walking, they'll tighten that proximal dial down and also the distal dial. So this guy was a runner. He wanted to have instant control of his socket in terms of fit. He wanted to be able to tighten that socket up, you know, prior to a race, depending on what his volume was at that moment. So he could crank that thing down if he needed to for the race, and then he could quickly release the compression when he was done with the race to give himself a little bit of relief. So pretty interesting design. This was all done with pre-preg. So it can be used, our system RevoFit can be used with pre-preg carbon and with a nice coated paint over the top of it. So really slick design. This also used flexible plastic, and you can see there's quite a bit of opening there, allowing for a lot of expansion, muscle movement, and just an extra layer of comfort for the patient. However, the frame, where necessary, was quite rigid due to the pre-preg process. And so here you see a hip disarticulation socket. This is a bikini style. So these have the iliac crest pads that you can see there, connected to our HP releasing guide. So the HP releasing guide is a separate piece that you can purchase, and that allows you to fully open and close the device. So you can open the device, don it, use a little tab to secure the release guide, and then they use the dial for compression. The one thing with hips and hemi patients is they have to either have a really tight socket for walking, or they have to have it loose for sitting. It's really difficult in the past to have both, simply because they use straps to tighten and loosen the socket. So if you can imagine, you know, having straps to tighten and loosen the socket, there's really no way to do that on the fly. They would have to disrobe, you know, drop their pants basically to tighten the socket when they were walking, and then when they went to go sit down to loosen the socket, again, they'd have to expose themselves to get to the straps to loosen the socket. So with this system, they can do all of that through their clothing. The dial is very strong. You've got 210 pounds of line tension there. So you can really get a really good purchase above the iliac crest and get really good compression to not only secure the device onto the patient, but also help stabilize the pelvis in relationship to the hip and to the hip joint, and really give good function out of the device. So in this particular design, as you can see on the left picture there, the dial was mounted kind of front and center. Probably not the best spot for a dial mount. That would most likely interfere with the clothing. So I would suggest with this design that maybe that dial is mounted just proximal to the hip joint itself. You don't want to interfere with the hip joint, but then also you don't want to have the dial in an awkward position on the socket. So again, this uses some iliac crest pads, HP releasing guides, and the dial is mounted in the anterior. Here are a few other examples of hip sockets. The upper left picture uses a rolled silicone insert and also has HP releasing guides. A little bit different. This was all laminated frame, and the HP releasing, they made grooves within the lamination for the HP releasing guides. We don't have HP releasing guide dummies for lamination, so you have to make your own. You can use clay, or you could use wax to wax up around releasing guide, or you could buy another set of releasing guides, and you can sacrifice one of the pieces in the lamination process and then replace it with a fresh piece after you're done with the lamination. So that upper left portion, or upper left picture, has one dial. The HP releasing guide allows them to fully open that top brim, down the device, and then tighten it down. And then on the bottom right picture, there's two pictures there, just another view of that Caucasian socket. And then on the right side, that is another hip socket that uses the lace as a hinge. So unfortunately, we don't have an anterior photo of that socket, but this is the posterior photo of that socket. And they're using the lace to create a hinge. So that's the hinge spot that you see in the back. It wraps around to the front side, and in the front, they used a simple Velcro strap to lace the route, to route the lace through. That simple Velcro strap allows them to fully open the device. They close it with the Velcro strap, and then they use the dial for added compression. Now I'll talk about supracondylar suspension. So this is something that's not done very often anymore, at least not in the United States. Other places around the world, they use supracondylar quite a bit because they don't have access to liners and locks and things like that. So kind of an old school method of suspension, but very effective. And it's not only used for suspension, but it's also used for medial lateral stability. Sometimes, as you can see, like in this photo here, some of these patients have very short tibia. So I used this as a suspension technique, and I also used it to create ML stability. So as you can see here, we mounted the dial on the medial side, and we created a medial brim essentially with the lace. Instead of using a metal medial brim, which can be quite heavy and cumbersome, we are using the lace essentially to create the medial brim. The lace creates the hinge point at the bottom, which, as you can see, it's right directly above the dial. The dial is mounted medial. Right directly proximal to that, the lace goes directly vertical. That creates the hinge point, okay? That allows that medial brim to hinge open. They can then down the device, and then as they tighten the dial and turn the dial, it slowly closes that hinge spot and closes that medial door and locks the device onto the patient. You know, one of the biggest problems with supracondylar suspension is donning and doffing, you know, and it's just, it can be quite painful if they don't have a medial brim. Or if you build it up like a stovepipe design, it's quite bulky. So this allows you to have easy on and off, very low profile in terms of there's no foam added here, so there's not a big bulky brim. You do have the height of the dial that you have to consider. So you may want to mount that posterior if this patient, you know, rides a bike or motorcycle or horse. Or you can mount it, you know, on the lateral side. You can also mount it proximal. For supracondylar, one of the first patients that we saw with this amputation or with this design was for an obese patient. He was quite large, and he could not use liners because he simply couldn't put them on. He couldn't reach down far enough to get the liner onto his leg. So he could throw socks down over his leg and kind of hook them and pull them on, but then he had no way to really suspend the leg. His thighs were too big for a knee sleeve, and he couldn't use any kind of a locking mechanism. But supracondylar was an option. The problem was he was not able to reach to the medial side of a socket because he was so large. He could reach to the lateral side of a socket, but not the medial. So what they did was they mounted the dial on the lateral side and routed the tubes and the lace around to the medial side to control the medial brim. So he could reach out to the lateral side and he could control the suspension of his socket that way. So quite a nice application for a very unique situation. But as you can see here, this is the design phase. This is kind of in between the steps. And you can see the dial is bonded to the socket. The tubing runs directly vertical, and then it turns. And as you can see, you want to make sure that the tubing is very, very close to the trim lines. So you have to clearly identify the trim line before you route the tubing. If the tubing is not close to the trim line, then that medial brim will teeter and move side to side. Okay, so it's really important that you go straight vertical to create the hinge point, and then you loop those tubes around and get them as close to the trim line as you possibly can. That really makes a very secure medial brim. And I'm just going to back up one slide, and you can see here that we didn't cut this medial brim straight across. Okay, the upper right photo is probably the best example of that. You can see that's kind of V-shaped or U-shaped. Okay, if you just cut that medial panel straight across, it's going to have very little strength and closure force, and most likely will wobble. So if you cut it in a V shape or a U shape, you gain a tremendous amount of compression and a tremendous amount of closure force. And it really is able to lock the proximal portion of the socket over the femoral condyle. If you wanted, you could also add a little bit of foam to this if you wanted to give the patient a little bit of extra compression. And as you can see here, this is a partial hand. So he had part of the palm of his hand was still remaining, but obviously a really challenging time to get the arm on and off. So we used a heavy duty dial. This is the RevoFit 2 dial, because this was used for mountain biking and kayaking. This device we use the panel simply for on and off, but later on, the prosthetist actually added a little bit of padding to that dial and allowed for some added compression. So he would use that added compression mainly when he was mountain biking. So he could crank that thing down on a long descent, so he had good control of the bike. And then on the uphill, or when it was a little more mellow, he could release some of that compression for some comfort. This panel really locked the arm into position and was a great suspension technique for this partial hand. Here we've got two different designs. On the left-hand side, we've got a wrist disarticulation, and that uses an adjustable anterior tongue. So there's two dials mounted there, and these were actually mid-power dials they had to create their own dummies for those because we don't have dummies for mid-power dials. So a little bit of out-of-the-box thinking there, but just wanted to show you what a wrist disarticulation socket can look like. That's a tongue that just opens and closes for easy on and off. And then, as you can see, there's a little wire that goes up along the lateral side of the guy's arm. And he had a humeral cuff that housed the batteries for that myoelectric. And then you could also get a little bit of compression, AP compression with those dials. And then he could also control them independently. So he could get a little bit of compression distal if you wanted it with the one dial, or he could move and use the anterior or the proximal dial for some more for proximal compression. On the right-hand side is the transradial, and this patient liked to have really high trim lines. So high above the epicondyles, he liked to have it really tight. The problem with that was, man, it was really difficult for him to get it on. He just struggled every time. And having the snap electrodes there was a challenge to get those through as he was downing and doffing. So what they did was they mounted a RevoFit 2 dial, a heavy duty dial on the medial side. You can't see it in this photo, but it's mounted medial. And they simply put a split down the posterior aspect of the socket. So it's basically two halves that can open and close. And that allows them to, pop the dial, open those two halves, the medial lateral halves, essentially, slide his arm in, get the epicondyles through the tight spot, and then he can slowly just tighten that socket, and he's basically controlling the ML compression with the dial. And he can tighten up around the arm, and he can get really good suspension. He can get added compression if needed. This guy was an outdoorsman. He liked to snowmobile and ride ATVs. So he really wanted to have this thing secure when he was on those machines. And we got one more upper limb socket here. And this also used a RevoFit 2 dial. And this created a bony lock above the olecranon. So this dial simply controlled the olecranon panel. He could release the dial, slide his arm on, close the olecranon panel, and he could get a little bit of compression by tightening up that olecranon panel. This guy used this arm for snowmobiling. And as you can see there, there's a battery mounted externally. That wasn't for myo control, that was for heating. This is actually a heated arm. The guy lived in Minnesota, and he wanted an arm that he could control the temperature with inside. And so we mounted a battery and heating elements to the socket to allow it to get warm. This dial was actually mounted on an inner socket with a hole punched through the frame. So the inner socket actually was a separate piece, and this is kind of a shell over the top. This red lamination is a shell over the actual operating frame within. And so that is our brief webinar on suspension techniques using the RevoFit system. Just some other ideas to think about in terms of using the RevoFit. The people are, like I said in the beginning of this, the people typically think of RevoFit as just an adjustable socket technology, and we just want to open people's eyes to some other applications that can be used. Typically for these bony lock, these disarticulation amputations, typically people are using straps to control the dial or to control the panel or the door for on and off. The problem with straps is they wear out and they smell and they're not easy to use. And if it's, if they get wet, they don't work well. You can't adjust them instantly. To tighten a strap, you have to loosen it first and then tighten it. So it's kind of hard to know, exactly where you are. With the RevoFit system, everything is controlled by the dial. One click is 1 millimeter of movement. So it's very precise, very micro, but it's very strong as well. 210 pounds of line tension, which is ample enough power to open and close a door. You can also use it for compression if you wanted to add some padding behind the panel or the door to give the patient a little bit of adjustability for their daily fit. So that's kind of the overview of some suspension techniques using the RevoFit system. Does anyone have any questions? And I'll kind of hand the mic over to Lauren here and let her.
Yeah, so I want to circle back to Nick. Nick had a question on the knee disartic, and he may have missed what the patient was using for the interface.
Yeah, so the interface, they are using, I believe it's a RevoFit product. It's I think they call it Super Soft. There's also Autobach product, very similar, also called Super Soft, and it's a flexible plastic. The one there is blue, so I believe that is an Autobach product, but there are numerous other flexible plastics that can be used. There's products made by Kerbel, Orfit, Proflex. The thing with the interface is that you want to make sure that it's flexible. If it's too thick or too stiff and not flexible, then the patient's not going to be able to feel the compression or the expansion and not be able to down and off the device very easily. So we like to have that, whatever that interface is, we like it to be around 3 millimeters of thickness. And that allows for a nice even flex. And you could also use a Keezy cone, which is a foam product. Those are used quite often. Or you could use a simple P-Lite liner as well. And beyond that, sometimes people go without a flexible interface. We typically recommend a flexible interface for containing the tissue. and for even pressure, no, to decrease pinching or anything like that. There's a lot of options out there, but the main point is if you're going to use a flexible interface, make sure it's flexible.
And then Laura was wondering if you've used polypropylene for a socket.
Polypropylene for a socket. The problem with polypro, we have, but things don't stick well to polypro. So there's really, you could attach the dial to the outside of a polypro socket, kind of as a temporary or a interim solution, maybe for a temporary prosthesis or a preparatory prosthesis, or maybe a dynamic check socket. You could temporarily bond or rivet the dial to the socket. You could temporarily bond the tubing to the frame using a 60-second composite adhesive. We use a lot of the FabTech adhesive for that application. And then we would wrap it with some fiberglass casting tape just to secure everything into place. But it's really kind of a temporary solution. I wouldn't really use that for long-term or any kind of definitive device.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions. So I'm going to go ahead, as the hands get raised, I will unmute you so you can go ahead and ask Joe your question. So Nick, go ahead and ask Joe.
So I'm pretty new to the system. Just seeing if there's a general recommended coding using the RevoFit. I've heard some different things, so I was just curious what your take is on that.
So for coding, you know, if it's used as a suspension technique, there are existing codes. So Supracondylar has a code. Symes has codes for posterior or medial doors. So there are some existing codes for using it as a bone lock or a suspension technique. There is no code for the dial as it, in terms of adjustable socket technology. That code, there is no code for that. We don't have one yet. It's something that we are working on, but it's a lengthy process. So some people, depending on who the payer is, they're quite successful using a 99 code. We don't suggest that if it's a Medicare patient, but if it's a private insurer, Blue Cross, Cigna, Work Comp, VA, they are having good success with 99 codes. And you can do same and similar. So you could do 99 code, same and similar, using the upper limb Teflon tube code. You could use same and similar heavy duty lace because we use a heavy duty Spectra lace. Our tubing is the same tubing, similar tubing that's used for upper limb, the Teflon tubing. So there's some same and similar stuff there that you can use. If you go to our website, clickmedical.co, and under knowledge base, we have some coding recommendations. And we've got MSRP is there. We've got letter of medical necessity is there. And we have some different coding strategies for different amputation levels that use the 99 code and give you some ideas as to how to use that. But as of today, there is no code for adjustable socket technology.
Perfect, thank you.
Yep.
All right, Oleg, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you here so you can ask Joe your question.
First of all, thank you for a great webinar. And then do you have in your plans to make the smaller size of the dial mechanism for pediatric, for the small size upper extremity sockets and so on?
Yes. That is something that we are working on currently. It may be a little while before it gets to the market, but yes, it's something that we are working on. Currently, what people are using for upper limb and for pediatrics is the Quick Fit Lacer. Our Quick Fit Lacer uses the low power and the mid power dials, which are quite a bit smaller. And those applications are typically used for light duty use. So upper limb would be considered light duty. Pediatric would be considered light duty. Maybe a small, geriatric or elderly patient could be light duty. And there are people using them, they're adding them to the outside of the socket, riveting them into place, because our quick fit system is only rivetable. You cannot laminate it into the socket. We don't have lamination dummies for those quick fit lasers. So you can use a smaller dial. We do have them currently, but if you're wanting to integrate the smaller dials into a lamination, that is something that you will have to wait for. It's in progress. I can't give you a time as to when those will be released, but know that it is something that we are actively working on. And if you want if you want some more information, Oleg, you can reach out to me directly, joe@clickmedical.co, and I can share some photos of some upper limb and pediatric cases that have used the smaller dials, and you can see what other people have done with a smaller system. The thing with the smaller dials is there's not as much power. So if you're putting them on a laminated socket or a really hard, rigid socket, they just don't have the power to close anything that's too rigid. You can open and close a door pretty easily, but if you're trying to distort or move the frame, the small dials just don't have the power, the capacity to do that. So we still recommend, for patients that are, pediatric patients that are active, or upper limb patients that are active, we still recommend using the RevoFit 2 dial. It is a lamination kit, so it can be integrated into a lamination. And that's really the most robust and secure dial that you can use, but it also has the highest build height. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, and we had a question from Alex about using the RevoFit for AFOs. And we actually have a fantastic video in our advanced knowledge base that talks about the RevoFlex, but maybe you could expand on that a little bit, Joe?
Yeah, we use we've got a kit called the RevoFlex, and it uses the high power dial, and we can use that dial to control plantar flexion or dorsiflexion. So you can control the range of motion of the device. And these are plastic devices. So these devices get sandwiched in between, the kit gets sandwiched in between layers of plastic. And the video, we have a great video that shows how that gets integrated. And you can use them for dorsiflexion, range of motion control. It allows the provider to adjust throughout their rehab cycle. So they could keep the AFO very rigid when needed. So if they're maybe walking on stairs, or they're getting weak, or they need more stability, they can have a completely rigid AFO. And then if they are getting stronger, need more range of motion, they can release the dial and get a range of motion with the AFO. Using the dial. Contra to that, you can also use it for flexion contractures. So you can run the lace in front of the joint, and you can actually use it to control and work out flexion contractures. So I would suggest you go to the website and you can see what the devices look like. And then you can also see how they're fabricated and integrated in between the layers of plastic. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks, guys.